Well, you fall off the boat backwards. My my partner, my wife, Jennifer Hayes, and I hold our masks. We roll backwards, and this is the way you get in the water. And when the bubbles clear, you see shafts of light, and you can see reflections of the surface. In clear water, you roll on your stomach. Even in cold water, you do the same thing in a dry suit. And you head down into the darker and more mystical part of the dive, into the rest of the dive. And you'll see everything from large marine creatures, which they like to call megafauna. I don't like that word, but it's, again, sharks or dolphins or even whales, manta rays. You may see those. Depending on where you dive, you might see the top of a reef. You might see a great school of fish. And in the last 20 years for us, and earlier for me, 49 years I've been working for National Geographic, you see this absolute parade of life. And it never, ever ceases to amaze us. We've looked in a lot of different places underwater in this voyage of discovery. And remember, every time you fall backwards off the boat, it is a voyage of discovery. And what we've seen are some incredible things. For instance, we went underwater, not in the ocean, but in the Okavanga Delta. One of the more incredible assignments we've ever had, because we were dealing with a rather large multicellular animal called a Nile crocodile, very large, and hippopotamus, and a host of other things in a world that was ultimately very strange. We went under the mats of papyrus which line the riverbank in the upper reaches of the Okavanga Delta. We dove in lily forests of pink and green and clouds of mosquito fish. We swam through tigerfish. We looked at diving spiders. We went at night to find something called the Zambezi squeaker, a very, very beautiful catfish. We looked at a system that fed all of the river. And they have a saying there that the Okavanga River is life, but beneath it is death. And very few people have ever gone underneath there. And for a moment, as the floods come, it becomes very clear water. You just have a month in the northern part, and then you follow the clear water down to the ultimate end in the delta. Here is a river system that flows from Angola and then through Namibia, northern Namibia, and into Botswana, and spends itself in the sands of the Kalahari, producing this enormous delta, which in essence is the world's largest oasis. It concentrates life, everything from the Zambezi squeaker catfish to hippopotamus, to crocodiles, to elephants, to giraffes, to lions, to everything that lives in this world. We dove at night, and we would anchor over a lily forest and light up the lily forest with our big HMI movie lights. And it became something otherworldly. It became an exercise in a living Art Deco, or actually living Art Nouveau. It was unbelievably beautiful. But at the edge of the pool of light, you could see two eyes. They glow like coals. Those are the eyes of the crocodiles. And if they're this far apart, they're small, but if they're this far apart, they're very large. This far apart is almost a foot wide. And as these eyes got closer and closer and closer, our guides, Andy and Brad Bestelink, would say, "David, Jennifer, get out of the water. Get out now." And I would say, "One more picture," because I'd be looking around mesmerized. We've been very lucky. I've never been bitten by a shark or never been bitten by a crocodile. Now, what's very funny is we spent a lot of time with sharks, everything from great white sharks to just recently reef blacktips and gray reef sharks in Fakarava in an atoll in French Polynesia, one of the most astounding places we've been, in Cuba, in Australia. But crocodiles, well, crocodiles are really quite frightening because I think We're used to being with an animal that's in the water, but a crocodile is a dinosaur. Unpredictable, extremely fast when it has to be, and yet has this idea of you're swimming with dinosaurs. Light is everything in the ocean, you're right. And the first few feet of water, color red disappears, and bit by bit, most of that end of the spectrum goes. So that by the time you're at 60 feet, red is black. Color red is black. And strangely enough, if you cut yourself, you bleed green. Now, if you take down a strobe, an electronic flash, that the inventor of the electronic flash, Dr. Harold Edgerton, who was a teacher of mine when I was at university, said to me, it's like a bottle of sunlight. And if you uncork that bottle of sunlight, in other words, push the trigger of the camera, the reef or anywhere else underwater explodes with light, and you see colors that have never really been seen before, because they're not colors of the surface, they're colors beneath the sea, and they have an extraordinary palette. Brilliant reds, yellows, oranges, colors that you can't even imagine. So every photographer has to supplement light. The light that falls down is the backdrop, dramatic shafts of light from the surface. And to that you add electronic flash, almost as if you're swimming around with a studio. And it takes that kind of approach. You are, in essence, trying to catch these creatures, and you have in your hand an underwater camera, and we use these cameras called sea cams. They're big underwater housings with large domes and two flashes that come out to here, sometimes 3 or 4. You look a little bit like a spider crab, a giant spider crab, and you position these lights as you're moving, as you're swimming. So it's basically being a studio photographer running through someplace on land, running through a field and trying to catch that moment, that decisive moment. There was a long reef, kind of a peninsula of a reef that stuck out 50, 60 feet down near New Ireland in Papua New Guinea. Very clear water. And I swam over it. I was alone. I swam over it, and I was instantly surrounded by this enormous school of chevron barracuda. And what these barracudas do is they do this wonderful thing, which is a defensive mechanism. They make a perfect circle, absolutely geometric perfect circle. And geometry in the ocean is something that doesn't exist in a weightless, cornerless world. And there I was in the middle of this perfect circle, and I realized that I was in the middle of a picture that I wanted to take. And it's one of these things, it's a terrible realization. So I swam back to the boat, and I talked to the captain. Her name was Dinah Halstead. I said, Dinah, you gotta come with me. She and her husband Bob ran a boat called Toledo. And she said she jumped in the water in about 2 minutes, and we swam side by side back to the barracudas, side by side. And as we got into this school, and they were still there, which is a wonderful thing, they began to circle again. And I crossed my fingers. I dove to the bottom. At about 45 feet, I rolled on my back and I looked up, and Dinah was in the middle of the circle, and the afternoon sun was glinting against the sides of the barracudas like a perfect silver wall. And then she did something amazing. Instinctively, she held out her hand like a ballet dancer, like a pas de deux, or one half of a pas de deux. And the barracudas circled, and they went 3 times around her, and then they disappeared. They broke up, they went into a single line, and they swam off the edge of this blue peninsula of coral. I knew I had a picture. I knew I had a picture, but this is film. And the working mantra for every photographer working in film then was this: paranoia pays. And I didn't want to be disappointed, so I just hoped. And when I got the picture back, we would, sometimes with film, we wouldn't see the images we made for 3 months. You'd shoot a lot, you'd shoot as much as you could, but it was all big casino. You didn't know what you were shooting. And when I saw this in the editing room at National Geographic, I just said, oh my God, there's a picture. We published it in a story on Papua New Guinea that was written by Peter Benchley, and the picture's still with us today. You know, pictures are like that. You can't go home to the same place and make a better picture. It's all like this tranche, this slice of time that can't be repeated. We go down to Antarctica with National Geographic on the National Geographic Explorer as National Geographic photographers. And one of the things we can do there is make pictures in the water, make pictures for ourselves and also for all the guests, show them what this world looks like. We've been shooting these icebergs, half and half in, half out images. And then in a place called Danko Island on the Antarctic Peninsula, we found this perfect iceberg. Actually, it wasn't an iceberg, it's something called a bergy bit, a mini iceberg. And on top of it was a group of gentoo and chin-strap penguins. Jennifer and I swam around it and swam around it. And these penguins were playing this game, and the game is called King of the Iceberg. They're flapping their flippers at each other, as penguins do. The gentoos are pushing the chin straps in, the chin straps are pushing the gentoos in, and they'd push each other over the side of the iceberg. And the penguins would dive down, and they'd fly underwater, and that's what they do. Penguins fly underwater. They move really fast. How fast? Well, it's like if you're at a party and you blow up a balloon and you release it and it whips around the room. That's what a penguin's like underwater, leaving a stream of bubbles. And then they'd pop up on the other side, and the games begin again. We were in the water for about an hour and a half, getting colder and colder. Remember, the water in Antarctica is -2 degrees Celsius, or just about 29 degrees Fahrenheit. It's really cold. And scuba diving, we dive for about an hour. When we're snorkeling, because we're moving around a little bit more, we can last a little bit longer, but your ideas and images last a lot longer than your body does. And when your fingers begin to be completely numb, that's when you really have to get out. Core temperature begins to drop. We just didn't want to get out. Gray skies, white icebergs. Flash would go off, illuminating the bottom part of the iceberg, and the penguins were flying and eating little bits of krill underwater and popping up. I can't wait to, it's one of those magic moments. The greatest underwater photo ever made is not an underwater photo. It was made by astronaut William Anders on Christmas Eve, 1968. One of the most terrible years in our history, but in one split second, one of the most momentous, important images ever made. He pointed his camera out at the little tiny window of Apollo 8 as it was coming around the dark side of the moon. And there in the foreground is the moon. Everybody's seen this picture. And in the background is the Earth rising, as it were, against the absolute black velvet of space. It's not a blue marble, but it's a sapphire. And this picture says one thing to all of us, every single human on the planet. It says, that's all there is. But for me, and a few of my colleagues, like Dr. Sylvia Earle, it says this is a water planet. She says, this is not planet Earth, this is planet ocean. And it is 70% of its surface. And blue is the color of life found nowhere else in the universe. And it gets back to that wonderful picture that William Anders took, Earthrise. In that Christmas Eve of 1968, the population of the planet was about 3.5 million. Now it's more than almost 7.5 million. Global climate change is a very, very real thing. We are working on a major project, part of a large grant from National Geographic, to take a look at coral in peril, mission coral throughout the world. Coral reefs are the thermometer of our planet, the barometer of our planet, and they face enormous changes. Bathed in hot water right now, they bleach. The algae within the tissues of the coral leaves, the coral turns white, and in some cases bleaches white and then dies, and reefs change. Rising sea levels are affecting all of us throughout the world. They affect the coral reefs. Incredible storms are coming right now, bigger storms than have ever been recorded in living memory. And all this change is happening because global climate change is about water. It's about rising temperatures, and one more thing waiting in the wings, that's ocean acidification. And ocean acidification is going to affect corals and a lot of other things within the ocean environment. Underwater, we are seeing the health of the ocean, the health of the planet, close up. We've been lucky enough, Jennifer and I, to see it from pole to coral reef. And we are seeing the changes right now. Coral reefs will change, not in the next century, but in the next 20 or 30 years. They are the barometer of the planet, and this is what we're working on. We can only truly protect this planet, and this is what we're learning right now, by reducing our carbon footprint. There is no doubt about it. These are the great sweeping changes that our planet is going through right now. Overpopulation, rising temperatures, acidification. I would say this: you win a war by saying second best today. And if we can begin to cut down on our carbon footprint, which means that we switch more to solar, to wind, and for our automobiles, probably electricity, that's going to change. If we have 7 million people changing like that, we will reduce the carbon output. We will slow the change in our oceans. I grew up in a real hotbed of underwater photography, which was New York City, New York, right in the heart of the city. And you know, when you're an 8-year-old kid growing up in the city in the summer, a lot of us were sent to camp in the Adirondacks, in the mountains, and I hated it. It was mountains, and I had asthma. I managed to wheeze my way up a few Adirondack peaks. I didn't like the horse. I didn't particularly like baseball. They sent me down to the waterfront, where 2 enormous 14-year-old counselors said, "Hey kid, why don't you go under the dock and clean out all the branches? And here's a mask, a blue French mask." I remember it absolutely distinctly as an 8-year-old kid. And I put the mask on my face, molded it to my face. I put my head underwater, and my life changed. And that I knew, for some reason, I knew at that point, that is the direction I wanted to take. I was weightless. I could breathe. Asthmatics, when they go in the water, just all of a sudden, all the weight of the world and all the weight on their lungs is lifted. A lot of asthmatic people are great swimmers. But I could breathe and I could see, and there were shafts of light coming down and fish swimming through this blue-green, simple lake in the Adirondacks. And what they really wanted me to see was an enormous water spider. Actually, they're called dock spiders. They're the size of a butter plate. They live under the dock. And they wanted me to see that and get completely freaked out, because that's the joy of 14-year-old camp counselors. But it had the opposite effect. It was mesmerizing. We had a summer home in Jersey, at a place called Elbron, New Jersey, on the North Jersey shore. where if you were lucky you could see your flippers. That's how bad the visibility was on a good day. And I had a pair of green flippers that looked like lily pads. They came from a company called Frankie the Frogman. Remember that well, and my blue mask and a snorkel, and I went underwater, and it was an escape. You know, Cousteau wrote about this in a book called The Silent World. When I was 10, I read it constantly, over and over again, almost like a Bible. And he wrote about the first time, and this is Jacques Cousteau, the inventor of the aqualung. He wrote about the first time he put his head underwater. And he was in a little tiny beach in the south of France, and he looked up and he could see a trolley car going past on the other side of the beach. He could see people screaming and yelling on the beach. He could see clouds and birds, and he put his head underwater, and he said this wonderful line: "I put my head underwater, and civilization vanished with one last bow." This is the world we live in. It is a planet of water. Well, the people who are afraid to put their face in the water, it's a natural reaction. I mean, my gosh, you're not supposed to put your face in the water, and humans don't particularly like the water. We're not a particularly aquatic animal. But they are missing this incredible portion of a planet. A coral reef, for instance, it is the greatest of all visual biodiversity in our world. And they'll miss that. And there are places you don't have to dive, but you can snorkel and see the reef. And there are places you can see turtles, you can see dolphins, you can see sharks, you can see all the things that this other 3/4 of this planet has. My father loved the water, though he was a terrible swimmer and never really wanted to go underwater, but he was a fisherman. We would go out, he would take me on fishing trips. We would go up into the Laurentian Mountains in Canada, where he grew up, or we would go, for the first time, he took me to a coral reef in the Bahamas. He wanted to go bone fishing, and he left me with the local dive guide who taught me how to free dive. I was in absolute heaven. I've always loved to swim, and I used to compete when I was swimming, but that's not it. I mean, diving doesn't require you to be it doesn't require you to be an incredible swimmer. It requires you to be happy in the water, relaxed, and the ability to have the water surround you and buoy you up. I wanted to take pictures underwater. It was a new and upcoming art. And in the mid and late 50s, it was pretty primitive. You could make your own underwater camera housing. That's the box that the camera came in. And the simplest way of doing it was taking a rubber bag. And my father, who's a professor of surgery at New York University, brought home a rubber anesthesiologist's bag. And if you stretched it, you could stretch it over a faceplate, the remains of an old mask. And they had bands on it. You put the camera in the bag, you put the glass of the faceplate over there, you put the band around it, and there you had an underwater housing. You could manipulate the controls of the camera through the rubber walls of the bag and make pictures. And the camera of choice, well, that was a Brownie Hawkeye. And the pictures that I made the first time around were absolutely terrible. I shot a picture of a man picking up an anchor in the Bahamas. And it was an interesting picture because there was a little bit of action in it. It was not exactly the Cartier-Bresson decisive moment. There was this surface of the water. It was made with an old Leica in a housing that was made in Britain, which you had a choice of either the f-stop, in other words, the diaphragm of the housing, or focus, but not both. So I decided that it was more important to have things in focus than perfectly exposed. And I discovered that what you could do is you could shoot black and white, which gave you a lot of latitude in the exposure. It was a lucky discovery because it was a basic training in how to see an image. Black and white is the base element of photography. It teaches you about light, it teaches you about motion, it teaches you about decisive action, it teaches you about gesture. Everything that you needed to know. A picture is made out of light, that is the basic element. A picture is made out of composition, and within the composition, there is a decisive moment. This is a term coined by the great French photographer Cartier-Bresson. The decisive moment, when you reach for something, when you jump for something, when you look at something. All photography is about allusion. It alludes to motion. It alludes to passion. It alludes to everything that humans want to deal with when we look in our natural world. Film captures it all. Film captures sound. Film captures motion. Photography can't do that. At university, I went to Boston University and I studied, I was going to be a marine biologist, and I decided that this was not the direction I wanted to go in. I wanted to make images, and I studied film and broadcasting at Boston University. And I did my first job for National Geographic when I was in my second year at Boston University. We will see something that's going to happen underwater because it's almost impossible to react. It's not like on the surface when the camera comes up and the picture's taken in one liquid motion. Underwater, we're pushing something the size of a toaster oven, and we have to anticipate. But when it happens, it's amazing. The sea lions circled by the Salima, the clownfish, the male clownfish guarding the eggs of the young and aerating them. It's a picture I worked on it for 10 years to see if it was going to happen. I photographed a lot of anemones. I photographed a lot of clownfish. I knew this is how parental guidance happens within the anemone. And finally, there was a moment that it all happened. The most precious thing in the sea is time. Time. And you may only have hours, sometimes minutes a day. We're in a world where we're nothing but trespassers. And we need to go farther and deeper. We need to make pictures in a world which we can't see, in a world without light, and yet make images without light. That's the future. It's most of the ocean. I've spent these 49 years examining the very edge of the ocean. So much more. We're looking at the engine of life on our planet, and we don't understand it. I've made a lot of pictures that seem to have legs on them. One of them, of course, is the circle of barracuda, because it's an image of humans in the sea. The other is a picture of a stingray and a sailboat under a slightly overcast sky in Grand Cayman Island and North Sound. And that picture's more about the quality of water, the whiteness of the sand. It's almost like it's almost zen the way the waves rake the sand in North Sound, just on the other side of the barrier reef. And the way the stingray's moving and the edge of the water moving up and over the dome, and the sky, which was going in and out of clouds, slightly overcast, in and out, bits of sun, had a softness to it. And I've never shot a picture quite like that. Stingray City is an interesting place. We went to do a story there in the mid-'80s. Fishermen would anchor on the sandbar behind the barrier reef in North Sound, white sand, and they'd clean their catch. And southern stingrays, which have always been considered, up till then, a fairly fearsome creature, you really didn't want to step on them because they could do some fairly decent harm to your ankles or your calf, when they shot their barb at you, they were a kind of a feared creature. A couple divers, friends of mine, went out there, and they said, well, we could feed these stingrays maybe and see what happens. And they went out there with a little bit of bait, a little bit of squid, and they fed the stingrays, and stingrays began to flock around them. And the pictures were marvelous, white sand and beautiful flying creatures. And they fed the stingrays. There were only 6 of them. Now there's over 106. Population fluctuates up and down. And last year, 750,000 people came to see the stingrays. It's the most popular dive site in the whole world. The Cayman Island government has permanently protected stingrays and sharks, and the stingrays act as ambassadors to the ocean. And we still go back there. What are we doing in the most popular dive site in the world with 750,000 people or 1,000 people a day looking at these creatures? After they leave, the stingrays revert to the natural behavior. And they begin to fly over the sand, or they'll lay down and sleep, or they'll go and eat crustaceans beneath the sand. And the wind, the silent waves breaking, whispers across North Sound. And it still has that quality. If you look at that picture, what I love about it is that there's a motion of the wave in it. If you look at that picture, there's a motion as the wave falls over the top of the lens. That's what makes the picture. It's all about this gesture, and it's all about this moment. You know, pictures, as a photographer, as a photojournalist, we are looking for a way to convince the unconvinced. Pictures have power, and they have the power to illuminate, and they have the power to even humiliate. They certainly have the power to celebrate. And they have the power to open people's eyes to the sea. That's what pictures can do. Picture that humiliates is a moment that I had when I was working on a story in the Izu Peninsula in a little town called Futo. It's about 60 miles south of Tokyo. And it's a fishing village with an inner harbor and an outer harbor of cement built just after the war. Our fisherman came to us and he said, I can't work tomorrow, or the next day after that, because they have caught dolphins and they will be driven into the harbor. And the dolphin fishermen of Futo, another group from another area, found an enormous group of dolphins, pod of dolphins, almost 1,500 strong, and they drove them into the inner harbor of Futo, closed a net which the dolphins cannot leap over, and began to slaughter them. And they let me stay because we had been working with a fisherman there for a couple months. They knew how my friend Koji and I worked and how hard we worked, so they let us stay. And I photographed this. What happened with those photos is the photos didn't appear for years because they were too graphic. If they had, it might have changed lives a lot. But those are the kind of photographs that open people's eyes. And 6 years ago, my friend Luis Ahoyas, formerly a fellow National Geographic photographer, put on the movie director's hat and went out and did a film called The Cove and won an Academy Award about a dolphin slaughter in another town farther down across from the Izu Peninsula called Taiji. People responded and people looked at it, but the power of those photographs are still with us. I mean, it also is a time and a place that's not going to be repeated because there's never been that large a dolphin harvest since then. I have a major passion for history, especially history of the Pacific War and the Atlantic War, the Second World War. Shipwreck, when a ship goes down, with all the fire and all the horror, it goes again through this curtain of water and becomes something else. Not a tomb, but something more living, a real living memory of a time and a place. Classical underwater archaeologists always refer to shipwrecks as the ultimate time capsule. And the same thing applies to our wrecks of the Second World War. We spent a lot of time with the National Park Service, with our friend Brett Seymour, diving on the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor. You can put your hand out to the side of the wreck. There's 1,177 men still entombed in that wreck. And as you go down, it's dirty green water in Pearl Harbor. And it's very, very spooky, very misty. But you can almost hear the voices, and you can hear the time and the place, and they're there still. But a shipwreck is also about a ship, and the challenge is to photograph it like a ship, to make pictures of parts of it that show it's a ship. Plane wrecks are very interesting too. In the Pacific, it was an aerial battleground. Constantly, planes were being shot down, and when a plane hits the water, usually it breaks apart like an egg thrown against the wall. Or it falls into deeper water. Or it winds up, as it falls down very slowly, upside down. There are a handful, maybe 15 or 16 plane wrecks for the entire Pacific War, of which thousands and thousands of planes went into the sea. Only a handful are still there, and when you see them, it looks like they're flying into blue gloom. I'm thinking about time and place and people. What happened to the pilot and the plane? What happened to the people on the ship? What happened when it rolled over and sank? And then there's this other magical thing with intact shipwrecks, is that you never see a ship until you see it when it's launched, and you see it when it's broken up on a beach in Bangladesh. But you never see the whole ship except if you're underwater. It wasn't a card. We would pack all our film into these wonderful little yellow cartons, and they sent us out with cartons, little tiny yellow cartons. They looked like sort of milk boxes, as it were, right now. And you'd put 60 rolls of film in, and you'd seal it up with packing tape, and you'd slap on the labels and do not X-ray labels and the addresses, and you'd take them down to air freight, and you'd send them away. I'd like to talk about technology for a minute now. When I first came to National Geographic, photographers, underwater photographers, could not photograph what they saw. It was a battle to try and make an image because we couldn't see wide and we couldn't see close. A National Geographic photographer named Bates Littlehales invented a housing called the Ocean Eye. This is in 1969 when I first started to work at Geographic. And it revolutionized underwater photography. It corrected the magnification. It let us use super wide-angle lenses that Nikon and other companies were coming out with. It opened up the sea. It let me make the pictures that I saw. And every single underwater picture you've ever seen, whether it's in a magazine or an advertisement or a motion picture, its DNA relates back to this invention, which was invented at National Geographic. Every single one. And we battled with this. We battled with the fact that the camera could only take 36 exposures. Clearly, you can't change film underwater or change lenses. And the digital revolution changed a lot of that. I would go in the field with as many as 10 different cameras on a dive. And that would give me 360 exposures if I shot all 10 in the space of 90 minutes or 2 hours. The digital system, which is the lens and the sensor, can record everything. Everything is numbers. And it records every nuance of shadow and every nuance of color. And what you come back with is a piece of information that the closest thing you can compare it to is a negative. It's not the picture. It's flat and almost lifeless, especially underwater. You may have all the information in it, and it is all the information. And when you add contrast, which is what the image needs, and saturation, the picture blooms. And it makes pictures that you saw. We have the ability to print pictures now. That's the other half of the digital revolution that has all the colors that the sea produces, especially blues. Every man, woman, child, starting at the age of 3, has a camera now. And we are making pictures that you couldn't dream about. We're making pieces of time that you never would have recorded before. We are changing all our culture and all our habits in terms of recording our lives. And this is everything from politics to art. A photographer now has a lot of competition, but a photographer now also has these marvelous tools. You can see the picture that you make, you can dream the picture that you want, and you can record a picture that has all the elements of the poetry and the light that you thought about. Go into the water, and we have 2 electronic flashes on long arms attached to the camera housing, or 3 sometimes. And you look at the side of a reef, or the corner of a cave, or the edge of a kelp forest, and there is enormous amounts of color there, color that you can't even anticipate. So there's always the element of surprise. And when the flash goes off, you don't see the color. You see simply a burst. Now we can look in the back of the camera and say, oh my God, look at this place, look at these things. What a surprise. And that's one of the great gifts of digital photography. We would work for months underwater, never see a picture. We wouldn't see a picture until it was processed. We wouldn't get home and reach National Geographic, and then we saw our pictures. Now we see them instantly. We can correct them, we can look at them, we can anticipate them, we can revitalize them, we can relight them. We can be photographers. I think what we want to do as we really look at the ocean is we need tools that go into this dark part of the ocean. We are working down to about 150, 200 feet. Some technical divers will go deeper, 200 or 300 or 500 feet. Submarines will go deeper than that, but they are like riding an elevator. You go up, you go down, maybe you can transverse a little bit, but not very much. And we're dealing with creatures that move incredibly fast in the water, and systems swirling below us, 600 feet down, worlds of squid, worlds of blue sharks feeding on squid, worlds of squid feeding on everything else, the rising of plankton at night, something we are working on right now. There are continuous surprises in the ocean, and to make these pictures in this dark world may require something more than light. We can shoot in very low light, but it may require something like sound or ultrasound to make the kind of pictures that the ocean is all about, the engine of the ocean is all about. Oh my God, is there a picture? Well, the honest answer to that, is there a picture? Well, it's the next picture, obviously, that I dream about taking, but there's all sorts of things I would like to see. Pictures from Iceland that I would like to take. Pictures going back to the shallow shelves shallow coral shelves of atolls in French Polynesia. Pictures of coral, pictures of penguins, pictures of icebergs. We're doing a lot of work shooting icebergs that are half in, half out of the water. Remember, an iceberg is the metaphor for the ocean. A little bit above, a lot below, unseen, unheard of, faintly sculptural, intensely amazing. That's an iceberg. And if you can shoot the picture half above and half below, that's a wonderful way to go about it. I do a lot of pictures like that. I love these pictures when you're looking at the surface and you're looking beneath the surface. To shoot a picture half in and half out of the water, you combine the two elements of our planet, the air world and the water world. And this very thin surface of the water, scientists call the meniscus, is a gateway, a division between these two worlds. And that's why these pictures are popular, because you literally are invited into this other world. You see the difference between two things. You see the difference between sunlight and shadow on the surface and color and depth beneath. And the trick is to combine the motion and the creature or the place underwater with the best that the atmosphere, the air world can afford. They're tricky in terms of composition and in terms of, just in terms of creative thought. They're more tricky technically because you have to make sure everything's sharp and you have to be able to light the bottom part of the frame and you have to expose the upper part of the frame. And the hardest thing about taking a picture that's half in, half out of the water are droplets on the dome of the camera. Oh my God, I'd love to capture, I would love to capture the northern lights, half in, half out of the water. I would love to see the fish of the Amazon in clear water. I would love to continue working on the East Coast and the West Coast of Greenland, working with icebergs. There are all sorts of holy grail imagery that I'd love. Actually, I quite love cold water. I don't mind it at all. And in Iceland, there's incredibly clear water. I love the quality of water. I mean, it is, without a doubt, the most precious commodity on our planet. It's life itself. I'd like to go to the Mato Grosso do Sol in Brazil. I'd like to see it's clear water. It's like photographing Amazon fish in clear water, a place called Bonita. We'd like to go to some more of the Antarctic islands, and for Jennifer and I, a special place would be the East Coast and the West Coast of Greenland. It gives you this perspective of the planet. You're in a weightless world that makes you feel, I mean, it's one kind of photography that literally doing the photography feels great. I mean, I can't even imagine what other kind of photography feels like that. Maybe the guys leaping out of aircraft and doing air to air as skydivers do. That feels great. Or possibly if there's some kind of photography called like spa photography. You're physically moving in a world that's 600 times thicker than air. You're away from gravity, and you're seeing a world that has very little relationship with the world above. Civilization vanishes with one last bow when you're deep. And that is a kind of idea that invigorates how you live on this planet. Divers do have problems with the ears from time to time, and it's one of the things that gives you the most problem is diving with a cold or pushing a cold, which is what we all do from time to time when you have the pressure of the assignment going on. And if you have a cold, there's something called a reverse block. In other words, as you come up, your eustachian canal becomes blocked, and you have an intense pain. So you can see the surface, maybe 10 feet above or 15 feet above. You can't get there without almost passing out or even rupturing your eardrums. So you have to go down and up and down and up until the mucus in your eustachian canal loosens up a bit, the air squeals through, and it equalizes your eardrum. Jennifer and I dive together. We work, when we go underwater, we may be separate yards away, sometimes, or more than that. We're self-contained but ready to go to each other's aid. And sometimes it's interesting. In the last story in Geographic, we had a wonderful crocodile slide between the two of us. It looked like I let the crocodile go after Jennifer, but it was a moment later that she turned and made a picture of him. And I warned her by firing the strobe really fast at the crocodile. If you're diving in Africa with a Nile crocodile, that's a very dangerous crocodile. Grouchy is more than enough to describe them. And the other incredibly aggressive crocodile is the saltwater crocodile. And that's all over Southeast Asia, from northern Australia all the way through the Philippines and into Raja Ampat and into Indonesia. That's a very dangerous creature. But these Cuban crocodiles, the Cuban crocodiles are fairly mild-mannered. During breeding season, they can be obstreperous, but not so bad. American alligators, not so bad. So everything is a little bit different. Well, South Africa is an entirely incredible place. It's the meeting of two great oceans, actually three if you include the Southern Ocean, the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean and the Southern Ocean. It's an incredibly rich place offshore. It's the home of great white sharks. It's the home of southern right whales. And it's South Africa. I can't describe it anything more. Cape Town is one of the world's most beautiful cities, and where we live, where we actually have a piece of land now that we may build on, just east of Cape Town, is a beautiful community. Right whales off a cliff right next to the house that we may build or mate every winter. Jennifer grew up in the St. Lawrence. We could have lived anywhere in the world, or anywhere in the United States, and we looked at the West Coast, and we looked at Maine, and we looked at the South. But St. Lawrence and our little town of Clayton is completely magical. Small and tight, cold in the winter, and in the summer glorious. 1,000 islands spread around us, and off the ends of our docks are a whole group of shipwrecks dating all the way from before the Revolution, all the way to very recent shipwrecks. There are bass, there are muskie, the water's clear, and the sunset, well, it sets right over Kingston, across the way, across into Canada. We have a partnership that, in essence, the best thing is that we can share an experience. To come up and have a moment that you've seen underwater that you can't talk about, can't share, is something that I wouldn't want to contemplate any other way. But Jennifer is making, and has always made, incredibly serious, very, very different images than I have. And it's important that we both make different things. We need to have 4 eyes, 2 brains, looking at the ocean. We need to have different points of view. We need science, we need art, and we need those moments that each of us individually capture. The ocean is all of our planet. And the ocean right now, from a coral reef to the poles, to the depths of the ocean, much of it is still totally unknown. For instance, for every swordfish caught, there are at least 15 blue sharks landed. And the swordfish that appears in, say, for instance, the fish market in Vigo in Spain, which is the main market for all of Europe, comes from our Grand Banks in the middle of the North Atlantic. There used to be absolute mountains of these blue sharks caught for every swordfish, 15 of them, and now there's just mounds of them. Sharks throughout the world are endangered because of the need, the Asian need, especially the Chinese need for shark fin soup. A delicacy, but with a rising economy, something you could have for lunch. Let me put it this way. This planet needs you. This ocean needs people. It needs engineers. It needs artists. It certainly needs scientists. It needs economists. It needs poets. It needs writers. It needs construction people. It needs everything that humans can throw at it. We are in times of great change, and our very survival depends on the survival of the ocean. And the survival of the ocean definitely depends on how we live on this planet, how we deal with the ocean. We need all the knowledge we can get. We are living on an ocean planet, and we know so little about it.